Let's look at PowerView from an IT architecture point of view. PowerView is deployed and accessed within the SharePoint 2010 Enterprise environment. So this is a requirement for using PowerView that we've installed and deployed this software. We install the PowerView feature into SharePoint by installing Reporting Services 2012 in SharePoint integrated mode. And this is a service application with this version of the product, so it's very tightly coupled with SharePoint 2010 once it's installed. We will need a SQL Server 2012 relational instance somewhere in our environment to use for the SharePoint integrated mode service database. This could be just an additional instance on whatever server is currently hosting the SharePoint 2010 content databases, but it is a configuration piece we need to ensure. Once we've installed reporting services, we can run and use PowerView, but we'll need a data source for our PowerView visualizations. And we have a couple of choices here. The first is to install and use PowerPivot for SharePoint within the SharePoint environment, and this also would be a SharePoint service application. In this case, we wouldn't need any additional components, and we would have a complete server-based environment at this point. We would develop those tabular mode databases for PowerView using Excel and the SharePoint add-in for Excel, and then deploy those to SharePoint by uploading them into a document library. Whether we use PowerPivot for SharePoint or not, we also could consume tabular models from SQL Server 2012 Analysis Services instances. Analysis Services-based tabular models can grow to larger sizes and have additional advanced features. And to understand what those features are, there are several lessons within the Analysis Services tabular mode section that you can review. End users interact with PowerView using a web browser that has the Silverlight 5 plugin installed. And these browsers can be either Windows or Macintosh computers. Now let's look at the PowerView server requirements. The first is SharePoint 2010 Enterprise, as we mentioned. The second is SQL Server 2012. For SQL Server, we need to use the Enterprise Edition, BI Edition in production, and in non-production, the Developer Edition or Evaluation Edition. PowerView does require one of these editions. It is not enabled within the standard or express versions of SQL Server 2012. And in terms of the SQL components, if we wanted to install PowerView and nothing else, we would need two components from the SQL installation. The first would be the Reporting Services Integrated Mode Service application, which we'd have to deploy into the SharePoint farm, and the second would be that relational instance for the Reporting Services service databases. Both of these components could be installed on the same server to minimize license expenses, or they could be distributed among different servers. PowerView's client requirements include the following platforms and browsers. Notice that we can use Windows 7, Windows Vista, Windows Server 2008 or 2008 R2. Of course, our end users are probably going to use either Windows 7 or Vista. You might notice if you're still running Windows XP, Windows XP is not on the supported operating system schedule. On the Mac OS X side, Safari is supported, Firefox is not. So your most common scenarios probably are going to be Internet Explorer 9 or 8 running on Windows 7 or Safari 5 running on Mac OS X.